Part 2 on the Christian and government from Romans 13, 1 through 7. I'm not going to read the verses again, but I encourage you to, as you go through this series, especially this series on the Christian and government, that you have your Bibles opened up to Romans 13. Occasionally we'll look at some other passages as well, but primarily that's going to be our text as we do this series of videos on how the Christian is supposed to relate to their government. One of the things that you can do, and actually I would encourage you to do it, don't watch too many of them, but just go on YouTube and type in Romans 13, or go on YouTube and type in the Christian and government, or go on any kind of an audio sermon streaming site, such as sermonaudio.com. There's lots of other ones. You can basically just Google free sermon streaming, and you'll find many sites where you can just stream sermons, and try to find one where there is a search tool where you can search by scripture, to where you can actually go through their archives and look at every sermon they have relating to Romans 13, 1 through 7, and just read the titles. You don't even have to listen to the sermons, but just by doing a YouTube search and just reading the titles, doing a search on Sermon Audio or any other site and reading the titles, you are going to find what historically, just looking at the historic opinion of the church, is just, we've just so radically departed from what is known as orthodox, or orthodox just means normal. Like when we say the orthodox opinion of the church, we're just saying the majority of what the people for the last 2,000 years have interpreted this to mean. The number one thing that you're going to see, and this is inherently American and Western too, but the number one thing that you're going to see is that Paul's command for us to submit to the government really means that we're supposed to rebel against the government, which is hilarious logic. Quite frankly, it betrays, it's eisegesis in the worstest form. Eisegesis just means to, iso means to put in, like when we say ex in Latin, we're speaking of out of. Iso is in, and then and Jesus just comes from gnosis, knowledge, words. Anyway, eisegesis just means to add into the text, to put into the text, and that is just rampant with this subject. But you're gonna have three different people, basically there's three different buckets that I'm finding that will explain to you that you're not to submit to the governing authorities, which is precisely what the text says. The number one, and this is, they're always going to quote the Old King James every single time, and they have to, because it doesn't say governing authorities or civil authorities. It was translated higher powers. Be subject to the higher powers. And they're going to read it in the King James 100% of the time, and their interpretation is, the way they explain this text is that Paul is not talking about government, but Paul is talking, when he says higher powers, that Paul is talking about spiritual powers or ecclesial powers. Spiritual being like the angelic. Ecclesial, that word just means church. So he's saying that who we're supposed to be submissive to is either angelic and or deacons, pastors, that type of thing, which is bad exegesis, first of all, but I won't even get into that. It gets very technical, but it's just bad exposition. It's bad explanation. It's you read the text, and it does not bear the sword in vain. Now, deacons and pastors are not bearing swords, and people aren't to fear them because they're holding a sword. I guess you can make the case that, yeah, we have examples of angels wielding swords, but are we, the church, supposed to be afraid of sword-wielding angels? I don't know, that's a stretch. But then he goes on to say that these higher powers, they collect taxes, and that we're supposed to pay our taxes. We're supposed to pay tribute. It's two different words. It's like saying taxes, fees, that type of thing. Just different ways that the government collects revenue from us. It's words like that. It would be like the difference between us saying fees and taxes. Well, they're both kind of the same thing, but well, the angelic are not collecting taxes or fees. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. It's bad exposition. It's bad exegesis. It's silly contextually. Think about the context. Romans 12, the whole second half of Romans 12, we learn all about doing good when someone wrongs us and not seeking revenge. There's that classic line about how the Lord will repay. We're not supposed to seek our own revenge, but the Lord will repay. And doing good to those who do terrible to us. And it sort of leaves it, that whole concept leaves you with the question, well, what do I do if somebody steals my car? The Lord will repay. Okay, so when a thief steals my car, or someone kills my family member, or something, some great crime has been committed against me, am I just, the Lord will repay? So, what am I looking forward to the great white throne at that moment? Do I have no recourse about the person who stole my car? Do I have to wait for the final judgment for God to make things right? Well, no. That's exactly why Paul segues into this discussion about government, because I'm not supposed to seek personal revenge, but that's precisely what the government is for. In fact, it uses those words, vengeance. It uses the noun form of that verb. And it's actually all through that text in Romans 13, 1 through 7. The government bears the sword. They're an angel of wrath. They're a minister of God's judgment. They seek vengeance for God, is what that text seeks. And so Romans 12 is telling us that we can't seek personal vengeance, but Romans 13 is telling us, God is telling us that, but I have instituted the government to do that for you. That's part of their function. In fact, that's one of their main functions. And so that's the context, which makes one of the other things that you're going to see, and you'll find this on YouTube and on the internet, but you're going to find people that say this is a late gloss. In other words, Paul didn't write this. This is something that someone has added later on, decades later, which the number one problem with that is there is absolutely zero, and I mean zero, evidence of that. Zero evidence of that. We have no evidence of that in any Greek manuscripts of any kind, nor any of the early translations, nor any of the late translations. It's just sort of made up out of thin air, and yet you'll find pastors of huge churches in the United States. One particular that I watched online on YouTube from the Midwest, where he regularly, through this series, continued to teach that this was a late gloss, that Paul didn't write it, which is just, it's irresponsible and astounding that someone of that reputation could say something so ignorant. One of the other, and this is the big one, this is the one that you will hear the most. I saved this one for last. The number one reason that they will say that we are not to, that we do not have to submit to the government is they're going to cite verses 3 and 4. Let me read that to you. Actually, I'll just read 1, 2, 3, and 4. I normally use the New American Standard or the ESV. I happen to have the NIV right here in front of me right now. But I'm just going to read it to you. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. And then here's the verses. Verse 3. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to you to do good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And again, there's those words from Romans 12. Okay, he's there. The government is there to reward good and punish bad, is essentially what Paul is saying. And so what you will see, and this is pervasive on YouTube, especially with pastors like Chuck Baldwin and others, and people that tend to, these are the same people that will tend to, you'll find them on online and on blogs and stuff, they love words like revolution and rebellion and so on. They will say that these verses are a mandate. These verses are a mandate. These verses are a qualifier. Not mandate, that's a bad word. These verses are a qualifier or a prerequisite for submission. In other words, they say that in order to submit to the governing authorities, like verse 1 and 2 says, these governing authorities have to be a type of government that rewards good and punishes evil. And so what they make this text out to be is that we need to rebel. And the need to rebel, they actually give themselves away. They give away the silliness of that interpretation. Because, think about this. Name one government in the history of man that has fully and completely rewarded good and punished evil. You can't. One doesn't exist. And so, if verses 3 and 4 are a prerequisite in order for me to submit to the government in verse 1 and 2, well then this is a non-statement, because there's never ever been an instance where that prerequisite would have been met. And so it's a silly non-statement that means nothing. And especially think about the recipients of this letter. Who's the recipients of this letter? Romans, the Christians at Rome. This is written in like 58, 59 AD. The emperor is a guy named Nero. And Nero was a right-wing, southern, Republican, born-again Christian, right? No. Nero killed his mother. Nero used to hold mock weddings where he would dress little boys up as effeminate men. He would dress them up as females and marry them in order to fulfill his lustful desires. Nero is the one that would go on to institute the beginning of the horrible Christian persecutions. And so the recipients of this letter, as they're reading this letter that Paul wrote in their church, that's what's all around them. That's what's happening in the city that they live in. Do you see how silly that interpretation is? Well, what Paul is saying here is that we are not to submit to the governing authorities who reward evil but punish good. Well, that doesn't even make any sense. Contextually, historically, they would have read that and thought, well, that's stupid. That this doesn't even mean anything. And so it just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. And grammatically, by the way, that's just an absolute falsehood. You can go through the grammar, and verse 3 and 4 is not a prerequisite to obey verse 1 and 2. What verse 3 and 4 is the definition of what government is supposed to do. Verse 1 and 2 is what we are commanded to do. Verse 3 and 4 are indicative statements of what government is intended by God to do. But in no way, shape, or form are they qualifiers. And so that's basically the three main opinions that you're going to see on the internet. Well, I know what you've got to be thinking is well, Paul doesn't possibly expect us to just submit blindly to the government all the time with no exceptions. There's no way Paul believes that. And yes, Paul doesn't believe that. And we'll get into that. With the next video, I think. But what I want you to just recognize is Paul knew that. Paul was writing to real people in a real church, and they lived under a terrible government. And Paul was willing to write this with no exceptions. It's not that Paul doesn't think that there are any exceptions. Paul knows there's exceptions, and again, we'll get into those. But Paul wrote this letter to a church that was suffering much, and he wrote it in such a way that he did not feel that it was necessary to include the exceptions. The thrust, the main weight of this passage is not the exceptions. The thrust, the main weight of this passage is submit. We are to submit to the governing authorities. That's what the Christian life is all about, is about submission. And I just wanted to point out really quickly